G'day mate, 40 here. I trust you had an amazing Thanksgiving. It's such an American expression, right? I notice Americans using that as a form of greeting, like the first sentence in an email. I trust you had an amazing Thanksgiving, and it just rings so false to anyone who's not American. Like, is there any other culture where that would be considered a normal way of beginning an email? Like, I trust you had like an amazing Christmas. I trust you had an amazing Ramadan. I trust you had an amazing Yom Kippur. I mean, from an Australian or British or Irish or French or German perspective, like, that's just kind of unfathomable to begin an email. Especially had an amazing Thanksgiving. Like, how many amazing experiences do we tend to have? Why am I running? I wanted to catch the light. So I crossed 6 lanes of traffic, abiding by the law. I got to cross 6 lanes of traffic when there was a walk signal. I find it so much more joyful and pleasant and safe an experience to cross 6 lanes of traffic when it is licit to do so than when it is illicit to do so. So people close to me on that very street, they got pranged, and they were simply just trying to drive across 6 lanes of traffic. So far more pedestrians get killed in Los Angeles than people in cars. So even when crossing many lanes of traffic and it's licit, you still have to keep an eye out for cars that might turn into you. But how would you react if you got a text message, an email, or a letter? So I trust you had an amazing holiday. This seems to put a lot of pressure on. I mean, how many of your holidays have been amazing? I'd say probably maybe 1% of mine, 2% of my holidays have been amazing. But I mean, my Thanksgiving, I spent it alone. Tried to go to the sports bar, but it was closed. And I had a perfectly pleasant day. I was alone but not lonely. I got to do some reading and catch up on some exercises and some writing. I might have done a live stream. Watch some football. A very pleasant day, but certainly far from amazing. And so now, in retrospect, when someone says to me, "I trust you had an amazing Thanksgiving," it makes me feel a little inadequate. Because however pleasant and productive my Thanksgiving was, it was certainly far short of amazing. That's the challenging thing about being single in your second half of life, is that you can keep yourself busy on work days, but on holidays and holy days, like, it just becomes painfully apparent that you're single, right? Particularly Orthodox Judaism, where there are all sorts of restrictions on what you can do on holy days. Your ability to run from yourself is limited. Certainly one day a week on the Sabbath, and then sometimes for 3 straight days on holy days. You've got, say, 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, and then that leads into the Sabbath. You got 3 days of Yom Tov of restrictions, and so your ability to distract yourself from what's missing in your life is eliminated, and therefore these days can become painful. But I trust you had an amazing weekend. Now, I generally like American enthusiasm, even as I gently mock it. So Then I go back to Australia, right, the more stiff upper lip attitude and the more kind of brutal way of communicating, sometimes feels like going into a blowtorch compared to the gentle positivity of the American, or maybe it's somewhat the Californian way of speaking. So if you think "I trust you had an amazing holiday" is like an appropriate greeting, then surely you are American. But many Americans find this like positive. It generates positivity. Do other people talk about positivity? For some reason I think this is a particularly American expression and way of thinking. Like, Americans tend to be much more optimistic than any other people of which I'm aware. Like, what other people are as consistently optimistic as Americans? Like, which other people put as much emphasis and regards so positively the idea and the ethos of positivity? But I like it. I like it when people at checkout registers tell you to have a nice day. I mean, I guess I also enjoyed mocking it a little bit, but it's nice. Now, Americans are much more naked in their emotions, I think, than Australians or the English. So I particularly like American enthusiasm when it's genuine, as opposed to scripted, as opposed to an expected social performance of positivity. I heard this one American call into Dennis Prager's show. She talked about living in Australia. She went to the Sydney Opera House, and after a performance she got up and gave a standing ovation, and she was the only person in the audience who was standing and applauding. So standing and applauding is not a typical Australian response unless it is to supreme acts of athletic prowess. We Australians might be even more sports mad than Americans. Certainly I think gamble more per capita in Australia than any other nation. But the English and the Australians are much more restrained in their emotional displays. I think certainly compared to Northern Europeans, Americans are more restrained, are more ebullient in their displays of emotion. I think even compared to Central Europeans, certainly more than Eastern Europeans. Now, are Americans more emotionally expressive than Southern Europeans? I leave that as a question mark. They're certainly not as emotionally expressive and emotionally intense as Middle Eastern people. So I was listening to Glenn Greenwald. He was on the Duran podcast recently, and there's an hour-long interview with him about criminalizing dissent. And Glenn Greenwald made a lot of great points. He pointed out after Russia invaded Ukraine that the European Union passed a law making it illegal for social media companies to carry programming like Russia Today or carry Russian state media. It became criminal, an offense to hear the other side's point of view. Now, I'm not quite a free speech absolutist. I have some sympathy for, say, banning ISIS and Hamas from social media platforms, but certainly don't have sympathy for banning Russia. I mean, this overwhelming anti-Russian loathing generated out of false attribution of the Donald Trump 2016 victory to Russian intervention is insane. I think Glenn Greenwald's absolutely right. How insane this is that we would not want to hear from the Russian point of view, and even making it criminal. All right, and And Greenwald makes a good point that in many of these issues, there's just one type of thinking which becomes acceptable in the mainstream media. So I often deride right-wing conspiracy thinking, but there's as much, perhaps, delusional conspiracy thinking among the establishment, which is why I'm neither an elitist nor a populist. I think sometimes the populists are right and sometimes the elite are right. But for 3 years, the first 3 years of the Trump administration, number one news story in America was Russiagate, which in effect turned out to be a hoax. Now, American news media were usually fairly careful in what they reported, but the inference that people took away from what they reported was that Russia essentially rigged the 2016 election and that Donald Trump was a pawn of the Kremlin, and that was false. So all sorts of prestige, Pulitzer Prizes came from Russiagate reporting, which in effect, if not most of the details, turned out to be a hoax. And then the dominant narrative about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? Any deviation from that, and you're depicted as a stooge of Putin, a stooge of Russia. Right? I think obviously that's turning out to be a hoax, and now we're even getting op-eds saying, yeah, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians may have died in this war, but the West is better off because we're weakening Russia, supposedly. And on Fox News, I noticed since the October 7 attack, I noticed not one pro-Palestine guest has appeared, to the best of my knowledge that I've seen. Obviously, the Arabs and the Palestinians, they have a fairly significant claim to the land that is the current state of Israel. I'm a Zionist. I strongly believe in Jewish claims to the historic land that is now constituted as the Israeli Jewish state. But I recognize that people of Palestine and the Arabs and indigenous people who've lived there for hundreds of years, they have pretty strong claims too. And yet, that perspective is completely absent from Fox News and from most leading pundits. I can't recall any of the leading pundits of the past 40 years who are consistently pro-Palestine. So there is this dangerous level of groupthink in the establishment and the mainstream media, and dissent on certain issues such as Russiagate and invasion of Ukraine is in some places criminalized and just elsewhere disregarded as completely out of bounds. And I don't think narrowing the Overton window is really in our best interest. We should want to hear the perspective of Palestinians and the perspective of Russians, right? To the extent that Putin is unpopular in Russia with regard to this war in Ukraine, it's because he has waged it too gently, in too understated a fashion, too ethically, with too many moral compunctions. And it's just stunning that the Ukrainian leader, President Zelensky, and Putin, under the auspices of the then Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, essentially within a month of Russia's invasion, February 4, 2022, come to an accord that would have largely preserved Ukraine by undertaking that Ukraine would not become a member of NATO or of the European Union. And the Biden administration and British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said, absolutely not. We're going to arm you and support you until you throw out every single Russian soldier on your soil. And so the West intervened and stopped Ukraine from reaching an accord, which would have been far more in its best interest than what Ukraine faces now, absolute humiliating defeat and loss of hundreds of thousands of lives, and the destruction essentially of Ukraine as a viable state. And the West, particularly the Biden administration, has been willing to fight to the last dead Ukrainian for the goal of trying to destroy Russia as a great power, which has not worked out. Restoring an Overton window would have been, a wider Overton window with regard to this topic would have been much more in Ukraine's best interest, Europe's best interest, America's best interest. And then another common talking point you hear in the Western establishment is that Ukraine has agency, Ukraine gets to decide what it wants to do, and the United States and NATO are not going to tell Ukraine what to do, that they're not going to negotiate with Russia on Ukraine's behalf, right? That's all up to Ukraine. But the Western establishment only believes in Ukrainian agency to the extent that that aligns precisely with the West's agenda of trying to remove Russia as a great power. So as soon as the Ukrainians want to do something that violates the West's agenda of trying to use Ukraine and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives to drain Russia from the ranks of the great powers, right, then the Western establishment has no use for Ukrainian agency. It's only when Ukraine's interests, align perfectly with the Western establishment's interests that the West then accords great importance to Ukrainian agency. Not remotely true, Luke. Try not to fall for Duran nonsense. Well, I don't think my opinions on the Ukrainian conflict have changed at all from listening to the Duran. I've only been listening to that podcast for 2 weeks, but I've been listening to John Mearsheimer for 15 years prior to that. So I fail to see how the Biden administration and Great Britain putting a stop to Ukraine's peace deal with Russia in the first few weeks of the war, how exactly that was in Ukraine's best interest, the world's best interest, America's best interest. Instead, we've got the most dangerous American foreign policy of any administration, stoking war, with Russia over Ukraine, stoking war in the Middle East. I mean, can you believe we have military bases in a sovereign country that does not want us? Syria. We have military bases in Syria. That's insane. We have all these military bases in the Middle East which just invite attacks by quote-unquote Iranian proxies. And here again, the interests of Iranian proxies are never getting to fully align with the interests of Iran. Right? Iran does not 100% control its proxies. Right? These proxies have agency. And so when they attack American bases, it may not necessarily be what Iran wants at any particular point in time. We're just massively escalating the chances of some direct confrontation with Iran, which would be absolute disaster. Sorry. And the more American military forces we move into the Middle East, the greater the chances of an attack on those forces, which would be disastrous. Remember when Reagan brought in thousands of US Marines as peacekeepers into Lebanon in 1982, and hundreds of them got blown up in a car bomb, and then we retreated with our tail between our legs. So the Biden administration's foreign policy has dramatically increased the chances of now getting into an unnecessary war with Russia, with Iran, and with China. Right, so the US is strategically at quite a weak position when it comes to defending Taiwan vis-a-vis China for approximately the next 10 years. And Taiwan seems quite reluctant to make substantial steps in its own defense. So the US is risking the loss of tens of thousands of American lives, like the destruction of much of the American Navy, many American bases, the loss of several US aircraft carriers, still may not be able to defend Taiwan. And Taiwan yet to show that it's particularly interested in defending itself. Like, Taiwan says some of the right things, but its own actions are absolutely pathetic. So we are risking a great deal for good strategic reasons. Right? There's a very good strategic argument for America defending Taiwan, but to needlessly provoke China, it seems to me a strategic catastrophe. So we provoked Russia by providing Ukraine with deadly arms. That was the first time President Trump got indicted, because of his reluctance, because of his unwillingness to transfer deadly arms to Ukraine. And that was the reason for the 2019-2020 indictment of Trump. But by arming Ukraine, you then incentivize Russia to go to war to destroy it. And the Biden administration is very open about wanting to send $10 billion worth of arms to Taiwan, which may very well incentivize China to go to war to retake Taiwan sooner rather than later. Mearsheimer is a joke too. Well, you need to provide some evidence. You can't show any evidence. This is a very respected international relations theorist who is the subject of much obloquy, but not much substantial fact-checking. So, for example, people mock Mearsheimer for consistently saying over the past 10 years that Putin has no plans to conquer Ukraine. Well, he doesn't. He only invaded with at most 190,000 soldiers. He is not intent on conquering all of Ukraine. Right now, he seems intent on annexing parts of Ukraine that are dominantly pro-Russian in sentiment and demographics. So somehow it's a zinger that Mearsheimer said Putin wasn't interested in conquering Ukraine, then Russia invades Ukraine. But not every invasion is an attempt to conquer an entire nation. Luke Ford has an Australian accent, very much thinks like an American. Yeah, well, I've lived here for 45 years. Crash, I hope you had an amazing weekend, bro.